this is John for MTG coming at you with a little bit of a discussion video and kind of a update in the middle of the video I'll get into. But the main thing was the other day on the YouTube channel here, I did ask questions, people's questions about Burn and Prowess, and one of the questions was posed in part by Ando. Part of his question was the key differences between Burn and Prowess, how do they play out, and what would I recommend if someone was looking to buy into the format. There was also another part of the question, but I'm going to cover that in a different video as to what my preferred build of each is. Basically just going to do the breakdown of what Burn is, what Prowess is, how are they different, what cards they share in common, etc. And also in the middle of the video I'm going to kind of break down the general layout of things that are going to be going on in the background of the channel, including the kind of pseudo relaunch of the Patreon page. So Burn is an aggressive red-based deck. Obviously, you know, things like Monastery, Swift Spear, Goblin Guide, Eidolon of the Great Revel, and then uses a bunch of spells like Lightning Bolt, Lava Spike, Searing Blaze, Boros Charm, Lightning Helix, Rift Bolt, Skewer the Critics to get your opponent dead. This is just a kind of a general build of Burn. There's nothing special in here. There's no Luris of the Dream Den in the sideboard. There's no Shauner's Incinerators. So I'm just going with basic builds of Mono Red Prowess and Boros Burn. So I'm going to be talking in generalities when I'm talking the differences between the decks. So both are obviously red-based decks. Both generally have between 18 to 20 lands as we take a look at a traditional Mono Red Blitz deck that I'll get into in a bit. But they do play out a little bit differently, and they do have different strengths and different weaknesses. Burn is definitely creature-based. It definitely relies on its creatures to do some amount of damage. However, Burn is much more capable of dealing damage to the face. You know, Lightning Bolt deals 3, Lava Spike deals 3, Skullcrack deals 3 to the face, Searing Blaze deals 3 to a creature and 3 to a player, Boros Charm deals 4 to the face, Lightning Helix deals 3 to the face, Skewer and Rift Bolt all deal 3 to the face. So it's definitely a deck that can, you know, burn people out from 15 to 20 life. You know, it does take a little bit longer than you do it in conjunction with creatures, but it does have the ability to, you know, win the game without ever dealing a single point of combat damage. You are playing a 2-color deck, so you do have to have some amount of white for your Boros Charms and Lightning Helixes. Has a little bit wider variety of sideboard options, especially in things like the Mirror Match or against graveyard decks. The main strengths of Burn is the fact that it's a 2-pronged attack. You have to deal with the creatures and you have to deal with the spells. So you need a wider variety of answers than something like Prowess. It requires you to be able to answer the creatures early and then either pad your life total, have counter spells to keep yourself from dying to the spells, or get the opponent or get the Burn player dead before they are able to, you know, draw enough Burn to deal lethal to the face. Burn is a little bit more vulnerable to life gain, as you know, most of its cards deal a finite number of damage. There's only one Prowess creature in the deck, and that being Monastery Swift Spear itself, so you don't really get a bonus off of a bunch of your spells. Whereas with Prowess, we'll get into in a second, Prowess, you know, tends to stack a lot of damage during 1 or 2 key turns. The other thing with Burn is relatively live off the top a lot of times. You know, oftentimes it gets the game down to like a spot where their opponent's at like 5 life and they have no cards in hand. And, you know, if they hit runner, the game's over. That said, you know, Burn is a little bit less vulnerable to something like creature removal, as most of its creatures, either Swift Spear and Goblin Guide, both have haste, so you can pick spots where, you know, you can just get in chip damage. Even if your opponent has like removal spells in hand, if they tap out, you know, there's that chance that you can get a haste creature in, or with like Eidolon of the Great Revel. You know, most of the time, most of your opponent's removal spells are going to deal them 2 damage to deal with the Eidolon. Sideboard options, you know, with the white, you tend to have a little bit more options. You know, you have more hard removal with things like Path to Exile. You have things like Core Firewalker, which can be difficult to deal with for other red decks, especially the Prowess deck that we'll be talking about in a minute. And overall, you know, you used to have access to things like Stony Silence and such, and you do have access to cards like Wear Tear, so you can still deal with pretty much everything in the game with the option of the red and white cards. And that's not to say Prowess can't run white, but one of its inherent advantages is the just being mono red, which we'll get into. But basically, when you're attacking Burn, you have to hit it from multiple angles. You have to pressure them and to disrupt them, either strip them of their spells and play a fast, things like fast Tarmogoyfs, a fast Planeswalker, etc. But Burn's biggest vulnerability is generally either cards like Life Gain, so things like Wormcoil Engine, Weather the Storm, opposing Dragon's Claws, Core Firewalkers, basically anything, Thrag Tusks. I mean, it does have some ways to prevent life gain with Skullcrack, Flames of the Blood Hand, and Roiling Vortex, but it is ultimately more vulnerable to life gain because most of its cards deal a finite number of damage. Why do I keep referring to finite number of damage? We'll get into that with Prowess. But Burn overall is a relatively stock deck. It's been one of the decks in the modern format for quite some time. Its build has varied over time. It used to be a 3-color deck with Atarkas commands and Wild Nacatls, and even before Nacatl was unbanned, Swiftspear was printed recently, well, relatively recently, for the modern format. So there's been a lot of things with the Burn deck that has changed over time, but the core of, haste creatures, Eidolon the Great Rebel, dealing damage to the face has always been kind of a constant with Burn. Whereas Prowess overall has been a relatively newer deck to the format. So if you're looking to get into the format, Burn has a much longer track record as far as success or being viable. It's a deck that's probably been viable for most of the format's existence. Obviously, there are times where certain decks are just like running rampant in the format and Burn can't compete with them. See Eldrazi Winter and Hogak, and even at the beginning of the Hogak, until Hogak adapted, Burn was one of the few decks that could kind of like have a reasonable Hogak matchup because the Hogak deck did so much damage to itself. So in terms of viability, Burn has a much longer track record of being a reasonable deck, but it is actually a little bit more expensive than Blitz. Its average turn kill is probably about turn 4. It can kill on turn 3 with certain draws, but those draws are much more akin to what you'll see from Prowess. Usually they involve your opponent either dealing some amount of damage to themselves or a draw of like Goblin Guide Swiftspear, like Goblin Guide Swiftspear, followed by like Lava Spike, Bolt, dealing a sequencing number of damages because you do 2 damage with Goblin Guide, then 5 damage the following turn, so your opponent's at 13. Then you would be dealing another 5 damage for combat, and then your 3/1 mana bolts. Requires a bit more specifics than the Prowess deck, but turn 3 kills are possible with this deck. Eidolon also is one of the key cards in the deck. It makes certain archetypes much more difficult to play. Things like Storm, basically anything that's trying to play a bunch of spells can expect to take quite a bit of damage from Eidolon the Great Rebel, especially if they're using anything 3 or less. And for the most part, Burn has a very good amount of utility because of the white cards it has access to out of the sideboard. It can adapt to almost anything in the meta. There are a few decks that are weak points, things like Dredge, because of the card Creeping Chill specifically. There are other decks like Soul Sisters and Bogles, which don't really care about Burn's game plan and just gain a bunch of life. Those are all kind of weaknesses for decks like Burn in particular. But once again, we're talking about decks that are kind of fringe. There are other decks that can be problems. Uropiles have been issues, especially with the Omnath printings. But once again, kind of the sub-theme of life gain. And that's pretty much it when it comes to Burn. It's a deck that I have probably the longest experience playing in the format. The deck this channel has been mostly built around. Oh, there also is another deck, Ad Nauseam. But Ad Nauseam is actually kind of a weak point for both decks because of just the specific access that it interacts on. But that's pretty much it for Burn as far as what Burn's strengths and weaknesses are. It's a 2-pronged attack. It has vulnerability to life gain, and the other card that is the other cards that are a bit of a problem for it are Chalice of the Void, which is a card that's an X XX casting cost, and then it has counters on it, and then whatever those counters are, you can't cast spells of that converted mana cost. Usually coming down on 1. There's only 1 or 2 decks in the format, primarily the one being Eldrazi-tron that play that card. That can be a problem for burn, but burn's casting costs are a little more spread out, so it's a little less vulnerable to Chalice. But as you see in the sideboard, they're usually packing some number of answers to it anyway. And then obviously life gain is a problem. And then the final card is Leyline of Sanctity, which is a card that basically says you have hexproof, and when your opponent plays that, the burn player is in a bit of trouble, unless they have something like Wear Tear, or Disenchant in their sideboard. They've brought that in. A lot of white decks used to play it. There aren't too many white decks in the format, actually, because it's not particularly a good color. And then decks like Death and Taxes and some of the other white-based aggressive decks are playing things like Burrington Forge Tender, Core Firewalker, Orgok Champion, cards that have protection from white. Burn usually gets around that by the card Path to Exile, but Leyline of Sanctity in particular can be a problem. And if you know your opponent's going to be bringing in Leyline of Sanctity, sometimes the burn deck will bring in even things like Core Firewalker if it's not good in the format to get around that particular card. It's one of the things with burn. Burn's usually roughly a turn 4 deck, so if you can go faster than burn, or if you can find some way to negate what it's trying to do with removal spell and life gain, or just a fast clock that can counter race burn. A lot of different ways to counter burn or counter spells plus a little bit of life gain and some source of pressure. Before I get into the second part of the thing with Mono Red Blitz, I want to go over one point with Patreon. It's been a while since I've actively done anything Patreon. I'm going to be starting to post some content there, especially once I start getting more consistently into playing certain decks. Probably start posting sideboard guides again. We're going to be doing some breakdowns of specific matchups. I've seen some other people do that with I know Nikachu does it with Merfolk. I think Grimflare does it with Black Green X. Going to start getting into that kind of stuff again. Going to be doing that maybe once or twice a month. Nothing too fancy, no specific timetable, but I'm going to be doing at least a couple times a month. Will not be behind a paywall. I think the content's just going to be free for everybody. If you'd like to support the channel in that regard, it's only going to be $1 and $2 tiers. Nothing too big right now. And then the big payoff is there's going to be a couple stretch goals. The first one being once we hit 50, I'm going to try to do 5 streams a week instead of 4. And then once we hit 100 at some point, what was the goal I had in mind for that? Can't remember what the goal for that. I had it written down somewhere, but now I can't remember what it was. And then basically the incentive for you guys to donate is both here and on Twitch. If you donate $15 cumulatively, not at one shot, I'll be doing donation deck lists. The catch with this is I'm only going to be doing one a week unless it's Foz. Foz has an exemption because he's just donated an absurd amount of money over time to see decks played, so whenever he donates things, he pretty much jumps to the front of the line. But there's going to be maximum of 1 donation deck list a week, and I'm going to be keeping track of both Twitch and Patreon, and once you hit that $15 mark, I'll be getting in contact with you about what deck you would want to see played, or if you want a particular discussion video or something. That said, I'm still going to be doing these discussion videos for people, especially when I'm asking questions on the community page on YouTube. But you're here for the discussion, so just wanted to give a heads up on that. I haven't updated the page yet, but that's going to be coming. The second deck we're discussing it's labeled as Mono Red Blitz because Goldfish can't actually name decks correctly, but this is the original, or a variant of the original Mono Red Prowess. The actual genesis of this deck is it was actually a Mono Red Phoenix deck. It was a variant of the Arclight Phoenix Izzet decks. It was meant to be more aggressive. Was playing things like Arclight Phoenix, Faithless Looting. So it would pair Soulscar Mage and Monastery Swiftspear with Arclight Phoenix to kind of have both an aggressive early game and this recursive late game to give people problems. And that was kind of a cute deck. It often would run out of gas. I don't think it ran many Bedlam Revelers at that point. But a lot of the other cards that were playing in this build were kind of in common. And then they printed the card Lava Dart in Modern Horizons. And that card really, put this deck into overdrive. What this deck is trying to execute is a Prowess-based deck. So you're seeing Monastery Whisper in common with Burn. You're seeing Soulscar Mage, which was printed into Monkahet, which has the special subtext of, if a source would deal non-combat damage to a creature an opponent controls, put that many -1/-1 counters on it instead. It basically allows you to shrink creatures permanently with your burn spells. And then beyond that, it is playing a lot of burn spells. It's playing lightning bolts and lava spikes. It's also playing cards like Lava Dart and Wild Slash. Some play like Burst Lightning, that kind of stuff. Some play Seal of Fire. Like the secondary burn spells are kind of whatever. Like some don't even play Lava Spike in favor of things like Flame Slash or things to clear stuff out of the way. Once again, we're talking about the stock mono red Prowess lists, which have kind of fallen out of favor, but this is kind of the basic thing with the deck. Another thing with the deck is gets to play a lot of basic mountains. Mana base is a lot cheaper than Burn because you're not playing the fetches and the shocks, especially the fetches. And you don't even necessarily have to play the canopy lands. Bauble isn't necessary in certain versions. Like some people would play more burn spells, etc. Bauble is just kind of a way to thin the deck out a little bit, make it a little bit smaller. Manamorphose, very similar. The thing with both Bauble and Manamorphose is they are cantrips that power up your Prowess creatures with Swiftspear and Skullscar Mage. And then Light Up the Stage is obviously a 1-mana spell a lot of times whenever you're playing things like Lava Dart, Lava Spike. Crash Through is a way to make sure your creatures can get through opposing blockers, which is something Burn sometimes has to use burn spells on solely. Can't just swing their 5/6 Swiftspear into an 0/1 and it gets blocked and you waste all this damage. Crash Through is a trample effect that also allows you to draw a card. Really, one of the advantages of Prowess is that it sees a lot of cards. It tries to get a lot of cards in the graveyard, and then its late game consists of the card Bedlam Reveler, which oftentimes you can cast for 2 or 3 mana. Draw 3 cards, continue the chain. So, how is Prowess different from Burn? Prowess is much more reliant on its creatures dealing a ton of damage. Monastery Whisper and Soulscar Mage and Bedlam Reveler all have Prowess. Some of these variants have even adopted cards like Kiln Fiend, which was a card that's a 1/2 for 1 and a red. Every time you play an instant or sorcery, it gets +3/+0. And then in conjunction with things like Crash Through allow you to really close out the game quickly. The downside is your burn spells are a lot less efficient. Well, you have Lightning Bolt and Lava Spike, which are just anything as efficient as Burn plays for 1 mana. Wild Slash and Burst Lightning and Seal of Fire, they all have diminishing returns in terms of the raw damage output they have. Lava Dart is only a 1 damage spell, and then you can flash it back for sacking a mountain. Great for triggering Prowess on your creatures, fill in the graveyard for Bedlam Reveler. However, it just doesn't deal as much damage as a Bolt or a Lightning Helix or a Boros Charm. So, Prowess is much more reliant on its creatures to finish off the game. So it's a little bit more vulnerable to creature removal than a deck like Burn, who can literally burn you out from 20. That said, it is a better grinding deck. You see a bunch of cards with your cantrips, your Baubles, your Crash Throughs, your Manamorphoses, your Canopy Lands, which Burn also plays, but Burn also plays a little bit higher mana curve. With the exception of Bedlam Reveler, and Bedlam Reveler being kind of your late game recoup card advantage, threat plus spells in one package. So, Prowess is kind of a weird deck in that it can play a grinding game, but it can also end the game really quickly, especially in the versions playing things like Kiln Fiend and such. It's a deck that often spends its first turn or 2 casting creatures, and then has a big chain of spells in one turn. Trigger a bunch of Prowess, trigger a bunch of triggers on your Kiln Fiend or your Bedlam Revelers, and then swing out in one turn, either having cleared your opponent's board or cleared like all but one blocker, and dealing 15-20 damage in one turn. Now, it can play a chip shot game. It can play a bit of a grinding game, especially if your opponent's struggling to keep up with removing all your creatures. And there are other variants of Prowess that have popped up. In addition to the mono red version, there's the Is It version, which takes advantage of evasive blue flyers. There is a black-red version that's a little bit more akin to a mid-range deck that still has a little bit of the aggressive elements. But I'm specifically talking stock Boros Burn, stock Prowess. And then there's also variants that are getting more closer to the mid-range that are a mono-red version. And most of those have been kind of pioneered by a gentleman named Magic user named M. Hayashi. So, what are the big advantages to Prowess compared to Burn? How is it different? What's it weak to? The big advantage with Prowess is less vulnerable to life gain. It can literally shrug off a Weather the Storm for 15. Not 15 spells, but 15 life. And, if you're trying to combat Prowess with the same things that you're trying to combat Burn with, Ley Lines of Sanctity, life gain, that kind of stuff, you're going to be a lot less successful. The spells still can't target your face. You can, Lava Dart your own dude to trigger Prowess. You can Lightning Bolt yourself to trigger Prowess, etc. So, this deck is a lot better at ignoring some of the stuff that attacks Burn. Still struggles with some of the things like Core Firewalker and such, but can overwhelm that by sheer amount of threats on the board, etc. Or there are some different cards on the sideboard that we can get to here in a sec. The vulnerability of this deck is flat out removal. Its creatures are far more important, so if you answer their first couple of creatures and you have some way to either disrupt Bedlam Reveler or can kill them before Bedlam Reveler can come online, their deck's a lot less effective. They're not going to burn you out from 20 generally unless it's a really long game. They are a deck more reliant on the creatures, they're more vulnerable to creature removal, etc. And because of Bedlam Reveler, they are ultimately a little bit vulnerable to Graveyard Hate, especially cards like Relic of Progenitus and stuff. Bedlam Reveler can get stuck in their hand, be unable to cast, and also the problem with drawing multiple Bedlam Revelers in the same, like in an opening hand, or say having one in your opening hand and drawing another one, is you ultimately have to discard one. So, another huge advantage of Mono Red Prowess specifically is it gets to play the card Blood Moon. This is a card that can be quite good in a lot of matchups. There's a lot of other different ways to disrupt land bases in the format, but Blood Moon is definitely one of the most effective. And then the other thing the deck gets access to that maybe something like Burn doesn't is the fact that its mana base is generally a lot less painful. Now, Burn's mana base has gotten a lot better with printing of Inspiring Vantage, but you're still going to generally deal yourself between 2 to 5 damage with Burn. Either, having a shock in a Sacred Foundry, or Fetch Shocking for that, or a couple Canopy lands. Whereas Mono Red Prowess, unless you have a canopy hand named after Horizon Canopy with like Sunbay Canyons and your Fiery Islets, your mana's going to be relatively painless. So your opponent is going to have to deal you most of the time the full 20 damage, or at least 19 damage. So a little bit harder to kill Prowess than it is Burn sometimes, if you're in racing situations. Another card these decks play sometimes that Burn doesn't usually play is something like Kozilek's Return, which is a pseudo sweeper. It doesn't really kill your creatures. It does kill Burns for the most part, other than Swiss Spear. And then beyond that, your permanent-based hate is usually things like Dragon's Claw for the mirror match, and then your graveyard-based hate is usually artifact-based. So, if someone's bringing in like enchantment removal and, for like Rest in Peace. But oftentimes that's not particularly relevant, but it is just something to note. And then Obviously, being red, you're a little bit more limited on your sideboard options. You don't have access to things like Path to Exile for problematic creatures, so you're more reliant on cards like Flame Slash or Soul Scrimmage sticking and just like shrinking their creatures with burn spells. So there are strengths and weaknesses to that in that regard. But once again, the main difference is Prowess is a little bit better of a long game deck than Burn in terms of grinding through its library, grinding through what your opponent's doing. It can often exchange resources and not care as much. Like it can much more easily trade 2 burn spells for a creature if it continues to pour on damage, because it's going to see so many cards between Light Up the Stage, Bedlam Reveler, etc. Whereas Burn, Burn might struggle to trade a Bolt and a Lightning Helix for a creature. That's 6 points of damage not going to your opponent's face. So it's a little bit better with trading resources in that regard. Obviously, it's a lot worse in terms of its creatures mattering. And then, it can kind of shrug off life gain and that kind of thing. As far as Ando's question about what deck is better to get into the format, Prowess has a lot shorter pedigree than Burn. It's only really been around for maybe about a year and a half since the printing of Lava Dart, and even before that in its previous incarnation where it was a bit more of a meme deck than actual powerful. That said, Prowess has probably been a more consistent top dog than Burn in that time stretch. Both decks have oscillated through Tier 1. Prowess is currently on its way down a little bit, especially the Is It variety, which was become the more popular of the two, mainly because Death Shadow has been a huge thing. I would say in general, Prowess is a cheaper deck to build, mainly because you're not getting the fetches and shocks, and you don't necessarily need Mishra's Bauble. You can literally just go with like 20 mountain or 18 mountains or that kind of stuff, and it's a little bit cheaper. Let me actually look up the prices of the particular decks. So we can have some idea of what's going on as far as which deck's cheaper to get into the format for. So Mono Red Prowess, we're looking for the Mono Red variant that we played. Mono Red Prowess, the version that I'm looking at, not the one that's on the screen currently, but let's see if I can find the one that's actually on the screen. So one that's on the screen is $170 in tabletop, with most of the cost coming in the form of these canopy lands. So if you want to get a bit of a cheaper version of the deck, you could like cut the canopy lands, cut the Mishra's Baubles for either more burn, or there's some other red cantrip in the 1-drop slot. I think there's another one, I can't remember which one it's called. You're looking at about this particular exact version of the deck's $170, but you can cut the canopy lands and you're like looking at like 120, 110, and still basically operating at almost maximum efficiency. A little bit more tendency to flood out maybe. And then the burn deck that we were looking at is a little bit more expensive. It's still reasonable by modern format standards, but it's going to cost you this version in particular is $500, but that's mostly tied up in the fact that this is running 4 Scalding Tarns, which is the most expensive fetch. If you run something that's not those, then it's probably significantly cheaper. Yeah, the much more normal mana base is going to run you about $400. So, in terms of what deck is better to get in the format, if you're looking for longer pedigree, Burn is a better deck. If you're looking for a little bit cheaper price tag that still has the flexibility to either stretch into Burn or stretch into the other variants of Prowess, Prowess is cheaper and probably a more effective deck in the format right now. So that's kind of what you're looking at there, mainly because the huge difference in the price tags is the mana base. Even with Canopy lands, this is 170. This one runs the Canopy lands, and it's running you, well, about $400 once you cut the Scalding Tarns for another red fetch. In terms of fetch land, it really doesn't matter which red fetches you use. You can use Arid Maces, you can use Bloodstained Mires, you can use Scalding Tarns, and you can use Wooded Foothills. It really doesn't matter, especially in the Boros variety, because you're not fetching any type of basics or anything other than mountains. So, and Inspiring Vantage isn't running all that much at this point. I think it's like $14 for the playset. But in terms of getting into the format, Blitz is just better value in terms of price tag at this point. Once again, some of it depends on your meta. Prowess is a little bit more vulnerable to removal heavy decks. It can grind through, it can play a long game with Bedlam Reveler, but that comes with time. And then there are a lot more variants of Prowess than there are Burn at this point. There's a couple different Burn variants. Not going to really get into that in the video, but just in terms of the stock mono red Prowess deck versus the stock Boros deck. The stock mono red Prowess deck's a little bit cheaper. Well, actually a lot cheaper. It's about half to a third the price, and is just as effective, if not slightly better, than Burn in terms of results of late. So that's kind of my feel on the deck, and I hope that expanded enough on Ando's question, and I hope you all got enough out of this. Anyways, this has been John for MTG Nexus.